Thank you for that. Thank you for that introduction. And it's a pleasure to speak to you this morning. That was just to make sure that you're all wide awake and listening. What we're going to do is, in the brief time that we have, speak a bit about the way Israel's story is told internationally. I'll explain in a second why I know something about it. And then I'm going to leave as much time as possible for questions and answers and discussion, as I know that many of you are quite familiar with this place and with the story and will have interesting things to throw at me. Yeah, sorry about that. I just, if I stand behind a podium, I feel like I have to be respectable and knowledgeable. And if I'm walking around, I can kind of let loose. I was born in Canada, and not in the United States. Canada is not part of the United States, unbeknownst to many Americans. And I moved here when I was 17 in 1995, and I came with a fairly simple set of ideas about the country. I intended to be here for a year working on a kibbutz, which, as many of you probably know, is a communal farm, a kind of socialist settlement. And I was going to milk cows for a year and then go back to college, and I just got stuck. So I've been here since 1995. When I was 19, I was drafted, which is what happens here after high school. Israeli men serve for 3 years and Israeli women serve for 2. So when I was 19, pretty fresh off the boat still, I found myself in a very strange guerrilla conflict in South Lebanon in the late 1990s, a war between Israel and Hezbollah, which is a Shia militia affiliated with the Iranians. At the time, it was less of a serious player than it is today, but it was becoming more and more serious, and I found myself on this hilltop in South Lebanon, miles north of the Israeli border. So I had moved to Israel to be part of the Israeli story, but I very quickly found myself outside of Israel in a different country called Lebanon, with a group of Israeli soldiers. There were about 60 of us on this isolated hilltop, which was called the Pumpkin. That was the name of the outpost. The Israeli outposts in South Lebanon all had names like that. They were called Red Pepper, Outpost Basil, Outpost, many different names of flowers, Outpost Citrus, Outpost Cypress, and ours was Outpost Pumpkin. And I had a series of very powerful experiences on this hilltop as an Israeli soldier who had recently been a kid from Toronto, and the strange kind of leap from being a kid from a pretty sleepy suburb of Toronto, which is a sleepy city, to being in South Lebanon. That's the fuel for this book that Akiva mentioned, which is called Pumpkin Flowers, and which came out last year. And the book is about, and this is not going to be the topic of the talk, but it might be interesting. The book is about the way that war foreshadowed America's conflicts in the 21st century. And the war that we saw in South Lebanon ends up being a kind of run-through for the wars that America experiences after the dawn of the 21st century. So this war in South Lebanon ends with a unilateral pullout and the destruction of Outpost Pumpkin and the destruction of all the outposts with their pretty names in the spring of 2000, as part of what we thought was a move toward peace in the Middle East, because in the 90s, most Israelis, myself included, believed that that was the direction that events were going to take. We were going to pull out of territory, we were going to cede it to our neighbors, and in return we were going to get stable democracies around us, and we were going to have a new Middle East. That was a term that people used without irony in the 90s. A new Middle East, a better Middle East. Israel pulls out of South Lebanon in the spring of 2000, and we don't get a better Middle East. We do get a new Middle East. But it's not one that's better, and it's the Middle East that we know now. So the vacuum in South Lebanon is filled not by democracy and progress, but by Hezbollah, and we've had successive rounds of violence there since then. Israel pulls out of Gaza in 2005, again, hoping to kind of make things better, and that vacuum is filled by Hamas, and we've had successive rounds of violence since then. Iraq collapses and is not replaced by democracy. It's replaced by chaos in Syria and Libya and Yemen and Sinai. And this is the logic of the new Middle East, and Pumpkin Flowers is about my own very narrow viewpoint on the beginning of these events as a soldier who did not understand what he was seeing in the late 1990s. When I got out of the army, I went to university and I studied Islamic studies and got a job as a journalist, initially for an English language news magazine here called the Jerusalem Report, which some of you might be familiar with, and then beginning in the summer of 2006 with the AP, the Associated Press, which is the American news agency, as many of you probably know, one of the big players in the mainstream news market, the biggest news organization in the world, according to the AP. According to Reuters, Reuters is the biggest news organization in the world, but one of those two are right. So what I'm going to do with the rest of the short time we have is look at the way the story is told through the lens of my own experience at the AP. As time went on, I realized that the gap between the story I was writing for vast audiences in the West was the gap between that and the story as I knew it, as I'd seen it as a soldier at this outpost, as I knew it as an Israeli living life in this country. The gap was too wide to be maintained, and I had to leave. And in the summer of 2014, when we were in the midst of a nasty, I guess, mini war with Gaza, with Hamas in Gaza during the summer of 2014, I published 2 essays about my experiences in the international media as a way of explaining why the coverage of that conflict looked the way it did. And the essays got around, and some of you might have read them. And I'm just going to talk about that very, very briefly, because I think for anyone trying to figure out the story of this country from abroad, you need to understand the pipeline of information and the way it works and the ways in which it is broken. And I think that the fact that it is broken is clear to many people who know Israel or who are sympathetic to Israel, but the way that works exactly is mysterious. Well, I happened to see it, and I saw it as someone who did not believe that that was the case going in. So I was very happy to get a job at the AP. I was very happy to start working as an international reporter in 2006. I thought there would be no problem for me inside the international press system, just so you don't have to guess about my own political leanings. I'm from the left of the political spectrum here, so I don't vote for any of the parties who are currently in the coalition government, and I wish we had a different government, just so you don't mistake what I'm going to say for some kind of conservative polemic. I didn't expect to have a problem working for a place like the AP, and yet I did. There are 2 ways in which the story from here is skewed as it travels from where we're sitting right now in Jerusalem to audiences abroad through the pipeline of the mainstream media. And mainstream media is a term that I hate because it makes me feel like an angry, radio talk show host of some kind. But the mainstream media is actually a thing, as those sitting here know. And we're talking about the big players in the industry, what some would call liberal media: BBC, New York Times, AP, Reuters, CNN, and so forth. Those organizations tend to move as a pack. So if you see a story, not just from here, but from anywhere reported by one of those organizations, chances are the other organizations are reporting more or less the same story. So there's kind of a herd mentality, and if you understand one, you'll it won't be too hard to figure out what the others are up to. So there are 2 ways in which the story gets skewed. One is the scope of coverage, and one is the content of coverage. And the scope of coverage is an interesting example where we can actually quantify the level of obsession with a given story, and we can do it by looking at staffing numbers. How interesting does a news organization find a particular story? So when I started to work for the AP Bureau here in Jerusalem in the summer of 2006, I was hired as a temporary reporter to cover a war that summer with Hezbollah in South Lebanon, and then I stayed on. The number of reporters we had here in the summer of 2006 was 40. We had 40 full-time news staff covering the Israel story. So I'm not talking about fixers or cooks or accountants. I'm talking about people who are in the field covering the news, people like me, a print reporter, stills photographers, TV crews, people who are actually out in the field doing the work of covering news. The number was 40. And just as a parenthetical aside, again, many of you probably know this already, but Israel is a very small country. Israel is 1/100th of 1% of the surface of the world, 0.01%. In terms of population, it's about the size of New York City, 8 million plus people. As a percentage of the landmass of the Arab world, it is 0.2%. So it's 1/5 of 1% of the landmass of the Arab world. It's a very small place is all I mean. And we had 40 people covering it when I started to work for the AP. As a point of comparison, that was more people than the AP had at that time covering China, which is a large-ish country of about 1.3 billion people. We had more people here than we had in India, which is another very large country of 1 billion and change. It was more people than we had in all of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa combined. That's 50-odd countries. There were more staff here in this little place than we had in all those countries combined. It was more staff than we had, and this is the key one in my opinion, in all of the countries where the Arab Spring eventually erupted combined. So this was 2006. The Arab Spring started happening 4 or 5 years later. In all of the countries where that happened, there were fewer reporters than we had in Israel. So if, as Westerners, people have wondered why no one warned them that the Middle East was about to implode and why they heard so little about the pressures under which Arab populations were operating for decades, the reason is that no one was interested. People were interested in this place and much less so in other places. The entire AP staff in Syria, when I started to work at the AP, Syria being now, unfortunately, for all the worst reasons imaginable, the most important country in the Middle East. There are more than 500,000 people dead in Syria. There are more people displaced in Syria than are still in their homes in Syria. And it's the worst refugee crisis on earth since the Second World War. The entire AP staff there, when we had 40 news staffers covering this place, was one. The AP had one part-time stringer covering Syria who'd been approved for the AP by the Assad regime. And that was the extent of the Western world's interest in Syria as reflected through AP staffing numbers, which are a partial measure, but I think an interesting one. These things are very hard to measure, and that's one way. The interest in Syria was less than 1/40th of the interest in Israel, and that makes sense. I think if you have just read Western media, you know that that's the case. No one cared about Syria before the Civil War started, and as soon as the Civil War goes away, people will go back to not caring about Syria, and the interest in this place will remain quite intense. One potential explanation for why the interest is so high is that there is a terrible conflict here. A conflict that warrants more coverage than all of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa or all of China or whatever measure I just mentioned. People do believe, I think, when you speak to people in the West, people do believe that there is a very serious conflict here. And if you look over the past 30, 40 years, maybe more, this is the most heavily covered conflict in the Western world. So other conflicts come and go, and we'll eclipse this story briefly. So, Ukraine might be in the news for a couple of weeks, or various Yugoslavia in the 90s, but those conflicts come and go. So they'll be heavily covered, and as soon as they peter out, they're gone, and no one's interested in them. This story is always there. It's kind of the backbeat of the Western mind, and it never goes away, and that makes it very unique as a news story. International news stories don't function like that. They peak and fade, and this one doesn't. This one is always there, and it's been true for decades. And people think that there is a conflict here, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, however you choose to call it, and that warrants coverage that is extremely intense. Reporters don't like to point out the numbers, the fatality numbers here, in part because it's crass to talk about fatality numbers, and I accept that. And in part because if you talk about how many people are actually being killed in this conflict, it ends up pulling the rug out from under your story, and no reporter will ever do that in any story, not just here. So if you're sent to cover, an anti-Trump protest or something, just to give a current example, and you find that there are 2 people there at the protest, you might not say that as a reporter, because you need a story, right? You've gone all that way, and you're going to call your editor and say, listen, man, there are more cops here than protesters, let's just drop it. You might actually choose to say a crowd of or a small but vocal crowd of protest. There's many ways to do it, and you know this as reporters. You will sell that story. No one will wake up in the morning and in the story that they're supposed to report and say nothing happened today, because if you do that too many times, you're going to lose your job. In the city of Jerusalem, just to give you an example, Jerusalem is a city of about 830,000. So it's like an Indianapolis-sized city or a Jacksonville, Florida-sized city. It's like a small to mid-range American city. If we look at fatalities in Jerusalem last year, it's a conflict story, right? That's what reporters are here reporting. It's not a tech story. It's not a culture story. It's a conflict story. That's what the story is, and that's what reporters are here doing. If you look at fatalities in Jerusalem last year, and we take everyone, so we take people killed in the wave of stabbing attacks that we had over here that many of you probably heard about. If we include the assailants who are often killed by security forces, if we take people from both sides, Israelis, Palestinians, if we throw in domestic homicides and criminal homicides and every person who died in violent circumstances in this city last year, the number is 18. There were 18 violent deaths in this city last year. It's a city the size of Indianapolis and Jacksonville. In Jacksonville, which is a city where no one thinks there's a conflict, the homicide number was 119. And in Indianapolis, it was higher. If you look at the entire death toll here last year on all sides, Israelis, Palestinians, armed, unarmed, and just so no one confuses what I'm saying, there is a conflict here. It's real. Part of it's my fault, the fault of my side. It's not all the other side's fault. So that's not what I'm saying. I'm just pointing out the numbers and the scale of the conflict. The death toll here last year was about 110. It's very hard to get accurate numbers because no one will give them to you. So you have to kind of go through press reports and human rights reports and put it together. But that's the number, more or less. It's about 110 fatalities in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict last year. That's about a sixth of the number of homicides in Los Angeles County in the same period of time. And no one thinks there's a war in Los Angeles County. That's just kind of the daily violence that Americans are used to. So if you were going to Jacksonville, probably no one would say, are you sure? Is it safe in Jacksonville? Are you sure you want to go there? And I'm sure that some of you at least have received text messages from family or friends asking you if you're sure you want to come here now, or if everything's okay and have they taken care of safety. And if you look at the numbers, this is a pretty safe place. Violence here works differently. So we have very little criminal violence. Of those 18 fatalities that I mentioned in Jerusalem last year, a single fatality was apolitical. A single fatality was just a regular homicide. The rest was political violence. So things work here differently than they do in the United States, but the violence here is quite low, not just compared to other war zones. I haven't even mentioned other war zones because that's too easy. We're just, we could look at our immediate neighborhood. We could look at Aleppo, which is very close to here. We're about a 2-hour drive from the Syrian border, right? So we're close to all these events. We could leave here now, and if the borders were open, we could eat dinner in Baghdad. That's where we live. I'm not even talking about those places, let alone even more terrible places like Congo. I'm just talking about violence in America, the kind of violence that people are used to. And that's the kind of thing that isn't pointed out. So if the claim is that the scope of interest in this place is high because of the violence or because of the level of bloodshed here, that is not a tenable argument. That's not the reason for the interest in this place. You won't see those numbers spelled out anywhere, because they undermine the idea that this is a very important story. Now, I think people are allowed to decide what's important and what's not, but no one can tell me that this story is important because it is one of the worst conflicts on Earth. It's a different kind of interest. So that's the scope. There's something weird about the scope, right? There's a very intense interest. In the case of the mainstream media, it's often a negative interest, and the interest can't really be explained by looking at the graph of fatalities. The second part of the malfunction is the content of the story. And this is, I think, an interesting exercise for journalists, not necessarily journalists who are interested in this place. This is just kind of a journalism issue beyond the confines of the Israel story. When a journalist approaches reality and needs to write a story about it, you have a problem, which is that reality doesn't really lend itself to stories. So if you need a 600-word story about Jacksonville, just to pull out. I hope no one hears from Jacksonville. I'm just relentlessly insulting Jacksonville. I'm sure it's a beautiful place. You need to tell, what's the Jacksonville story? Now, there are probably a lot of Jacksonville stories, right? There's probably politics and poverty and infrastructure and sports and race and economy, and there's probably a large number of stories you could tell about Jacksonville on a given day. But journalism can't work that way. You need a story that people agree is the story that you can run with over time. So in some kind of weird, almost magical way, journalists end up agreeing on what the story is. And then they run with it, even if they're from different news organizations. A good example is now in DC, the story is Trump, right? That's the story. It's the only story in DC. Now, I'm guessing, and I don't know DC, and I realize as time goes on that I really don't know America at all. But there are probably a lot of other things going on in DC that you could report, and the American government is very complicated, and America is incredibly complicated, and there's probably more than one story, but there's an agreement on what the story is. And the story ends up being quite simplistic because it has to be boiled down to a 90-second TV spot or a 600-word news story, and a 600-word news story that's dating me as a dinosaur, right? Because I, was working as a daily reporter 5 or 6 years ago, and 600 words is now too long for anyone to read. So now it would be a tweet. What's the story from here? The story from here goes something like this, and this will be familiar, although it's not usually spelled out as explicitly as this. There's a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. A conflict is about something that happened in 1967. That's the occupation. And were the occupation to be reversed, there would be peace. more or less, that's the story. It's not just the story that's reflected through most of the big players in the news industry. It's a story that's believed by most Western governments. Certainly true of the governments in Europe, certainly true of the last US administration. As for this one, it's hard for me to tell, but that is the dominant, I would say, narrative in the West. And if you look at, that's the story that I reported as an AP reporter. I wrote hundreds of stories probably based on those foundations, based on that understanding of what's going on. If you look at the story with the eyes of someone who knows a bit about this place, you'll see that it's almost entirely fictional. What do I mean? There isn't an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that sounds weird, I know, because even Israelis and Palestinians will talk about it that way, but most of Israel's wars haven't been fought against Palestinians. They were fought against Egyptians and Iraqis and Lebanese and Jordanians. Israel's most potent enemy at the moment is Iran. Those aren't Palestinians. They aren't even Arabs. Israel's most potent local enemy is Hezbollah, which is a Shia group inside Lebanon that's affiliated with the Iranians. Those aren't Palestinians. So clearly, there's a regional conflict of some kind in which the Palestinians are one component, but not the only component. To give an American parallel, have you ever heard of the America-Italy War of 1944? Now, American troops were dying in Italy in 1944. But you've never heard of the America-Italy War because it's called the Second World War. And if you want to understand why American troops were in Italy in 1944, you have to understand the Germans, and you have to understand Britain, and you have to understand the Russians, and you have to understand Japan, and you have to understand many different actors moving this incredibly complicated conflict that spans much of the globe. And then you can understand why Americans are at Monte Cassino or wherever in 1944. It wouldn't occur to anyone to try to understand that conflict in isolation or demand an American-Italian peace agreement. Right? Because it's not the war. It's not an American-Italian war. It's something much more complicated. And our conflict here is the same. It's not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If it were, I think we'd probably be able to work it out. But in fact, it's a regional conflict. And it's not just a regional conflict in which Israel faces the regional actors that I mentioned. It's a much broader regional conflict in which the conflict with Israel is only one of many conflicts going on. So if you look at the Middle East, you'll see that there's war more or less everywhere around here, mostly in places where there are no Israelis or Jews or settlers or Israeli soldiers. And if you want to understand why Israelis and Palestinians have a problem that they can't seem to work out, then you need to understand the Russians and the Americans and the Iranians and the fate of minorities in the region, the Kurds, the Yazidis, the Christians, and you need to understand the rise of ISIS, you need to understand the regime in Syria, you need to understand the rebels in Syria, you need to understand the military regime in Egypt, you need to understand the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and you need to understand the local branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which is Hamas. Hamas is the local branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So we're talking about an extremely complicated region in which Israel's role is much smaller than people think, especially Israelis. I think that not only would the regional picture be unaffected by a peace agreement were one signed this evening, and I wish that were possible, I think the regional picture would be largely unaffected if Israel disappeared this evening. The broad fissure lines in the Middle East have nothing to do with Israel. They're about Shia Muslims and Sunnis, and they're about military regimes that have kept their people down for decades, and they're about poverty, and they're about economics, and they're about religious extremism, and they have not that much to do with us, and it's the kind of thing that's hard to see when so much of Western attention is focused here. So Israel ends up looming very large in your idea of what's going on in the Middle East, and that makes the Middle East hard to understand. And I think for many people, it is. If you think that this is politically the most important country in the Middle East, the region will not make sense. Leaving aside whatever religious or theological or historical connections you feel with this place, if you're trying to analyze events in the region through the lens of Israel, the region cannot be understood. So that's the first part of the story that I reported, which I think is fictional. I don't think there is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict any more than I think there was an American-Italian conflict in 1944. The idea that the conflict began in 1967, which is another tenet of the story, is much easier to disprove. There was a conflict here before 1967. And the War of 1967 was a symptom of the conflict that existed before 1967, of course. And there were wars here in 56 and 48, and there's been a conflict here since at least the 20s, maybe earlier. The occupation is thus a symptom of the war and not the cause of the war. And that's just a chronological statement of fact, and I don't think anyone would really argue it, except it's not in the story. People believe that the root of the conflict is the occupation, and were that reversed, there would be peace, but Israelis who have been around for longer understand that the occupation is in fact a symptom, so you could address a symptom Sometimes a doctor knows you need to address a symptom. And I happen to think we do a poor job of addressing that particular symptom. But I, like most other Israelis, whether they call themselves left-wing or right-wing, do not believe that treating the symptom will heal the patient, because the patient's sickness is not because of the symptom, it's the other way around. And that's a very important, I think, distinction if you're trying to figure out the Israeli mind, and it's one that doesn't come across in the international news story for the most part. The last point, and I think I'll end with this, is the idea that a reversal of the occupation or an Israeli withdrawal, which is a very common international demand, would bring peace. Right? That's I think a widely believed idea, depending on who you're hanging out with in the West, that if Israel were just to do A, B, or C, there would be a peace agreement here, there'd be a peaceful solution, and then it becomes very hard to understand why Israelis are not doing that. And people get very frustrated and angry at our refusal to do certain things that would make things better, that would solve the problem. If you believe that Israel has the key to solving the problem, then you can get very angry at Israel for not just turning the key in the lock. But Israelis see it in a very different way, and we see it not through some kind of simplistic moral prism about right and wrong. We see it through the lens of our experience in the Middle East over the past 20 years. And what has that experience shown? The experience has shown that when there's a vacuum in the Middle East, it isn't filled by something good. And that touches on what I mentioned at the beginning. But we've learned since the 1990s, when Israelis voted several times for withdrawals and for peace accords, that if you create a vacuum in this part of the world, it's filled by these guys with black masks and black flags and very different ideas about what the future holds. And we saw it happen here in the 90s when Israel created vacuums in the West Bank as part of the Oslo peace process. And in 2000, the most left-wing government we'd ever elected, which I voted for, was on the receiving end of the worst wave of terrorism that we'd ever seen. We lost more than 1,000 people. I was a student at Hebrew University at the time, between 2000 and 2003 and 4, when buses were blowing up in the city and cafes blew up in the city. They blew up the cafeteria at the university where I was studying Islamic studies. The violence that is now familiar to everyone from the Middle East, and not just the Middle East, right? It's familiar from Manchester and Paris and Lower Manhattan. That happened here first, and the Israeli mind begins to shift, including the mind of Israelis who have always been moderate and remain so, by the way, according to polling information. Israel pulls out of Lebanon, gets Hezbollah. Israel pulls out of Gaza and gets Hamas. And after that, the Israeli political consensus shifts in a pretty basic way. And since then, more or less, the parties of the left, what I still vote for, can't get elected. And since then, more or less, we've had governments of the right who've always taken a very tough line on security and who've always warned that if you're weak here or if you're conciliatory here, the results will be bad, not good, which doesn't make sense to someone from Canada. But the longer you live in the Middle East, it begins to make more and more sense, not because you become evil, but because you get that there's a different regional logic in play here, and that the risks here are incredibly high. The American adventure in Iraq, I think, is part of the same story, even though it seems very different. But if you believe that a vacuum will be filled by something better, then you might go into Iraq and remove the existing power structure in Iraq. And that's 90s thinking, because in the 90s, that's what people thought was happening. The Soviet Union collapses and you get something better, bad things go away and things get better, and everyone thought things were getting better. It's not the case. It's clear, and it's unfortunate to say, but America goes into Iraq, removes the existing power structure in Iraq, and instead of getting a democracy in Iraq, which was the idea, as hard as it is to remember from 2017, instead it turns out that the guy who was in charge of Iraq was kind of like the pin on a grenade. And if you pull out the pin on the grenade goes off. And the US military was on top of the grenade when that explosion happened, and more than 4,000 American soldiers died, let alone the number of Iraqis who've died, and the collapse of the country and the disappearance of minorities. And if you believe that all you need to do to create democracy is remove the bad guy at the top, that's the kind of mistake you make. And the same thing happens in Syria. Assad loses his grip in Syria. Remember the Free Syrian army and the Syrian moderates and those guys were supposed to take over. No one's heard of them for a few years, because it turns out that if Assad loses his grip, Syria just collapses into some of the worst violence we've seen in the world in decades. And there is no country called Syria. There is no country called Iraq. There is no country called Yemen. There's no country called Libya. The names live on in the Western mind. The terminology lives on. Those countries don't exist. They don't exist. So when Israel faces its political dilemmas, that's what we see. This is all very, very close. We're 2 hours from the border with Sinai, 2 hours driving right now from the border with Sinai, where there's an ISIS insurgency. We're 2 hours from the border with Syria, where 500,000 people are dead. We're very close to Iraq. We're not that far from Libya. This is all happening around us, and Israelis understand that a bad move or a foolish move in the West Bank puts the entire country in danger. And if you sit Israelis down in a dark room, whether they vote for the Labour Party or Likud or many other parties in the political spectrum, they'll tell you some variation of what I just told you. And none of that is reflected in the very simple story about this country that's exported abroad. Those, I think, are the two main ways that the story gets skewed as it's reported. And because I saw, although I didn't know how to explain it really at the time, but at the AP, I just saw that what I was writing wasn't explaining anything. And I kind of went off to do other things. And what I've tried to do since then is get beneath the surface of the politics of the day. Netanyahu said this, Abbas said that, the president said this, and so on and so forth, which explains very, very little. I've tried to get down to the surface, to the bottom of the pond and figure out what's actually driving the story. And that's led me to all kinds of interesting places. The book about the Aleppo Codex is an attempt to understand the importance of the most important Bible manuscript in Hebrew, which is called the Aleppo Codex, which ends up being a story about the most important ethnic line in Israel, which is between Jews who came here from the Islamic world and Jews who came here from Europe, which is a key to understanding almost everything that happens in Israel. Although people tend to see Israel as a European country, in fact, only half of the Jews here came from Europe, mostly Eastern Europe. Half of the Jewish population here came from the Islamic world and is native to the Islamic world. And if you don't understand that, the country is very difficult to understand. And that's becoming more and more important to understanding the country. And that's what I've been writing about more and more over the past couple of years. Pumpkin Flowers was an attempt to understand the present through the story of this outpost. And I feel that those stories will actually help me, because it's about me understanding primarily, help me wrap my head around this very complicated country in a way that these simple news narratives will not. And that's what I've been doing since then. Okay, I promised to be brief. I'm afraid to check my watch because I might have broken my promise. But I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments or whatever.
Mati, I'm going to call on the people for you. By the way, Mati just mentioned the Aleppo Codex. It's a book which won many awards. Well, this is because this isn't working. But then, okay. Mati is obviously a modest person. I think you can tell by his demeanor, perhaps because you're from Toronto and not No, I didn't mean it that way. In addition to winning many Jewish awards, it also was listed as one of the top, the top book list top 10 religion and spirituality books of 2012, and was second place for the Religion News Writers Association Award. So, Mati, we're going to, I think you made a very, very compelling case to explain the problem. Correct me if I'm wrong, you put out there 4 main pillars. You said that there's a structural problem, the number of people who are here, that there's more people here than in China. The problem of the story and groupthink. The difficulty of reporters understanding and reporting complexity, hence the fallback on the narrative of the occupation, and a difficulty of people to understand the reticence of Israelis for not wanting things to be worse. I'm going to ask the first question, then we're going to open it up. In your work as a journalist, why don't some of the journalists who work here, but why don't they get and report the basic and fundamental decency of Israeli society?
Did everyone hear the question? I think that reporters operating here have a few problems. One has nothing to do with ideology necessarily. It has to do with a lack of knowledge. So if you come in here as a foreigner, you don't know the languages. This is a very complicated country. It takes years to figure it out. Maybe more than just a few years, but you have to start reporting immediately, right? Within a week or two of hitting the ground here as the correspondent for the Washington Post or the Times or whatever, you have to be an expert. You have to at least pretend to be an expert. And that's impossible. And if you can put yourself in the place of those people, imagine yourself being in, Korea or something, and you have to report Korea, but you have only been in Korea for a week and you don't speak Korean. So how on earth are you supposed to be an expert? So what you do is you cling to the simple story that others are reporting, and the simple story that's current in your social world. And the social world of the foreign correspondents ends up being the social world of the diplomatic corps and the NGO world, which is very large here and which shares certain political assumptions. So if I come in here, I'm the Washington Post correspondent, I was previously in Mexico or something, and I land here and I say, oh my God, you know, my editor wants a story within a week. What will happen is I'll go to a dinner party, and at the dinner party will be some NGO people, Human Rights Watch, a few European diplomats, the Times correspondent who also doesn't know Hebrew and was also somewhere else a couple months ago. And they'll fill me in on what the story is. And it has to be a simple story, right? We were talking about it. It can't be a complicated story. It needs to be simple. So here's a simple story. There's an occupation, and if there weren't an occupation, there would be peace. And what makes the story so powerful is that you can go and see it. Right? I can go to the West Bank and I can see a settlement, and I can take a picture of the settlement, and I can interview people who will say, yes, the problem is the settlement, and I can interview a Palestinian who will say that, I can interview an Israeli who will say that, I can interview 5 people from international organizations who are experts who will say that, and that's a story. That's a news story, and that's what they run with. Americans would find it hilarious if you tried to report on America without knowing English. Right? That would make sense to Americans. If I was standing in New York and I couldn't understand the shop signs and I couldn't understand what anyone was saying and I couldn't understand the news and I couldn't understand anything, couldn't interview an American in his or her own language, but I was an expert on America. I don't think people in the West understand that often the experts that they trust on international stories are just that guy. And the journalistic talent ends up being bluff. The ability to stand in front of a camera and bluff with a straight face. And I figured this out, actually just so you don't think I'm only criticizing others, I figured this out by mistake when I was sent in 2008 to Georgia, not Ray Charles, Georgia, right, but Soviet Georgia. The Russians invaded Georgia in the summer of 2008, and I stumbled into the AP bureau here, kind of bleary-eyed with a cup of coffee, and my bureau chief said, Mati, the Russians have invaded Georgia, and you need to go to Georgia. So I didn't know where that was, really. I mean, I guess I had an idea that it was not too far away, and indeed it is not too far away. And within 24 hours of that conversation in Jerusalem, I was in a Russian military convoy invading Georgia. How I got there is a long story that I'd love to tell you, but I think it would take too long. I was in a little kind of Soviet-era car in between Russian armored personnel carriers in a convoy that was invading Georgia with a photographer from Belarus and a Georgian driver. And I was reporting to the AP bureau in Moscow over my cell phone, and I was the Western world's eyes on the ground in this highly complicated geopolitical story. Now, I did not know Georgian or know, I think, that was a language at that point. I didn't know Russian. I had no map. So I didn't know which way was north. I literally understood nothing about the place where I was, except that my military experience allowed me to identify the kinds of forces I was seeing. So I could kind of get who these Russians were, just looking at their trucks, basically. But I had nothing else to offer, and yet I was an expert because I'm a journalist, and I was parachuted into the story, and I was going to tell the story. And I came back here thinking, that was an embarrassing experience for me. What does that mean about the way the whole thing operates? And of course, it operates in the same way, and that led to an increase in cynicism that ended up with me kind of having to find something else to do. Yeah.
Let's take some.
I should tell more of those stories. Yeah.
And we're going to go all the way to the corner in the back. So please speak loudly.
Sorry, I'll try to speak loudly.
And introduce yourself.
Thank you very much.
Wait, Akiva asked that you introduce yourself.
My name is Nicole Johnson-Yan. I work for the Keilah News. It's an online site in Israel. It's a fascinating perspective of your reporter here. So my question is, how can we correct the narrative? Like if you say this narrative that is based on the problem is the occupation, if we discuss the occupation of peace, so like here are a bunch of reporters who are now going to be writing about this, and I live here, so it's easier for me to, speak to the locals, but also people who live overseas. Like, can you give us some advice on like how to take this narrative and to correct it and present it in a maybe more correct or more accurate way?
I like to say that I'm a journalist, so I don't do solutions. We have a foreign ministry. We have Nitzan from the government press office. I just talk about the problems and, but yes, the problems with the reporting. Yes, I agree, and I don't think that even with the best, intentions of the foreign ministry or the government press offices would be corrected. I think that the solution is not to tell a positive story about Israel. I don't think that's the solution. Because often I think Israelis particularly think that is the solution, that we have all this negative coverage, and what we need to do is talk about how great we are and look at our beaches, and we invented the cherry tomato, apparently, or the disc on the flash drive, and we did all this great stuff, which is all true, of course, and I'm very proud of it. But that's not a news story, right? And you're not going to counter propaganda with another kind of propaganda. It just doesn't work that way. I think what's really missing in the story, and the way to correct much of what's wrong with the story, is regional context. The problem with the Israel story, when you really get down to it, is that it has been isolated from its surroundings. So if you think that Israel and the Palestinians exist in a vacuum, then you don't understand why Israel's concerned, and you don't understand Israel's history, and you don't understand who the Palestinians are, and you don't understand anything about the story if you treat it in isolation. If you understand that this is a tiny country in one corner of a vast and very troubled region, in which there are 6 million Jews living in one corner of the region, and Palestinians who are a minority under Israeli control, but part of the regional majority, which is Sunni Arab Muslims. If you start to understand this as part of the regional story, which of course it is, then a lot of the problems that I mentioned will go away by themselves. So if you have this story covered by someone who's not even based here necessarily, but maybe in Cairo, and who sees the region, then I think Israel's dilemmas become a lot more clear. So if you understand that the Palestinians are part of the Arab world and are buffeted by the same very troubling ideological trends that we're seeing across the Arab world, if you understand that Israelis who like to see themselves as European, in fact, are, to a large extent, Middle Eastern, who come from the Islamic world, who didn't come from Warsaw or from Berlin, they came from Baghdad, and they came from Aleppo. Baghdad was a third Jewish in the 40s. And most of those people are here. That's a huge part of the story. It's a Middle Eastern story. This is a Middle Eastern story, not a story about the Warsaw Ghetto. It's not a story about the Holocaust. It's not a story about Herzl. It's not a story about socialism. Not anymore. It's a story about the Middle East in the 21st century. And if you start to understand that, I think a lot of the problems will go away. So I think if I had to say one thing, it would be that. What mitigates against that is the fact that reporters are sent here often to cover just this. So you are the Jerusalem correspondent. It means that you're in charge of Israelis and Palestinians, and your job is not to then go bring in regional context, which you probably don't understand because your previous posting was probably Mexico or Washington, D.C. So you don't necessarily understand the Middle East, and you come in here and you make all kinds of you draw all kinds of conclusions based on what you're seeing, but you can't see the regional context that we see just because we live here. So I think regional context is really the key, not counter propaganda.
Matti, I think so. Rather than branding, a deeper engagement. I agree with you completely. Okay. Matti, if it's okay, since we have about 7 minutes, can we collect the questions and then? All right. So we're gonna, please, and yes, we have 2 over there, and then we'll go to David, and then we'll come over here, and then we'll get Luke. Move it. So please. Yeah, Matti here.
Hey. Where'd you go to high school? Sorry, guys. This will only take 10, 15 minutes. Thank you for having me.
Most of us here represent organizations that are predominant to a Christian audience. In Canada, one of the things that our struggle with is exactly what we refer to as the narrative. It's a single narrative that comes from a very single source. And while the source, in fact, thinks that all Canadians think. And so it kind of, what I'm trying to say is, how do we get a simple talking piece to give a broader context to that audience so they can actually see and make up their minds for themselves? I mean, that's what I struggle with. And it's very hard. I mean, with this, when you're drinking from a fire hose right here, and say, how do you bring that down so that we can empower the average person, the average listener, the viewer, to have and engage in a helpful conversation to their neighbors and to their colleagues at work. That's what I'm looking for.
Okay. Matti, we're going to continue, and then Malcolm.
Element important is the relationship between the journalists and the editorial board back home, because the editorial back home already knows the story, because it's heard it's a story from all the previous ones. So if the journalist here reports in a different way, it'll be edited back home to reflect the story, and they will put on a headline which reflects the story, which is why you sometimes read stories where the headline completely contradicts what the story is. So I think, in other words, it's not enough even to try and correct things locally here, because back home, all these places, Paris, London, Washington, whatever, they already know the story. So even if you try to change things here, it won't work, because they will change it back.
Thank you, Malcolm. David Parsons.
Hi, David.
Good to see you again.
Same.
It is on. It is on.
Okay, a two-part question. You have a unique...
You must be a journalist. That's a classic journalistic trick.
Okay. You have a unique perspective of serving in the Israeli army and reporting. And how much does the bias and especially the vitriol towards the IDF soldiers and a lot of the mainstream media, how much does that really impact the soldier in the field who's fighting the war under a code of purity of arms? You know, do they get frustrated? How does it impact them? And secondly, does Israel, saying we have this purity of arms, a citizens' army, a Western democracy fighting, against asymmetric warfare and such, how much is that a challenge to the mainstream media to try and catch Israel in a blunder or a massacre? Doesn't that sort of wave the red flag in front of them?
Okay, and Luke is the last question, and then we're going to give Matti a chance to respond.
Matti, I'm Luke Moon from the Philos Project. I'm a little unsatisfied with the ship of fools kind of analogy for the foreign press. I mean, if it's 40 AP, it's 40 Reuters, add Time, add Newsweek, you're talking hundreds. And yet, like, the whole group is so foolish and ignorant about talking about this in the regional conflict. I mean, heck, Congo has 6 times as many dead people as Syria, right? And nobody talks about Congo, right? So, is there a deeper, maybe religious, maybe ideological, maybe the connection between kind of secular journalists, Christians, Muslims, that kind of triangle? Like, what's actually below the ship of fools argument?
And one final comment, Matti. I'll ask for the person who's not here. Is it that bad? Is the media really that bad? Is the story not being conveyed at all? Because maybe it is in part.
Okay, there's no problem answering all these questions in full within 2 minutes or whatever. But just going chronologically, I think that if you have to point out, if you're talking to people who don't know anything, but who have a kind of a negative impression or have the idea that something bad is going on here, that Israel is some kind of malevolent actor that needs to be punished in some way, I think the way to do it is not to come at them and say, no, actually you think Israel is the worst country in the world. In fact, it is the best country in the world, and here's why. The thing to do is kind of just ask how much they know. You seem to have a very strong opinion about Israel. Do you know the size of Israel? Are you aware, how small it is? I think people are often surprised to hear that. Are you aware that the West Bank is a 90-minute drive from Syria? Have you had any thoughts about the connection between those two situations? There's a war in Syria, and there's the West Bank, which is 90 minutes away, where Israel's being asked to establish a state for Palestinians. Just confuse them with some details. And I think if you're talking to an intelligent person, they might say, oh, you know what? I don't actually know that much about it. And if you're talking to someone who is not intelligent and who has a very kind of fixed idea about what's going on here, you might not have any luck anyway. But that's what I've tried to do. I'll try to complicate things, not by coming back to them and saying, actually, things is great. Actually, the occupation's great. Okay, it's not. It's really not. It's a corrosive situation for the Israeli military and for the Israeli body politic. And that's all true. So it's not, I don't think it's a good idea to come back at them and say everything's wonderful and what you've heard is a lie. The thing to do is say, you don't not in these words, but to indicate that they don't know that much. And maybe they should learn. And if they really feel very strongly about this place, you can get on a plane and come here, which is what you guys have done. And if you spend a week or two hanging out here, you'll probably figure out that what you've been told is not true, even if you don't come away with the idea that this place is 100% positive. If I'm talking to people from Toronto, by the way, just because I am, I always like to ask, people come at me with a kind of a heavy ideological opinion about Israel. I always like to say, what language is Toronto? I'm from Toronto. No one in Toronto knows what language Toronto is, because there's no moral, accounting that comes with being from Toronto. So I grew up in Toronto. No one ever told me what language Toronto is. It's not English, right? It's the language of the people who had to be dealt with in some ways so that Toronto could be built as a city for, in Canada. And that also confuses people, I think. If you say, rather than playing defense for Israel, play offense, you have a very strong moral opinion about me, but how much do you know about you? You're from Massachusetts? What language is Massachusetts? What happened to the people who called Massachusetts, Massachusetts? Where are they? Are they still in Massachusetts? Or do they go somewhere else? Why? Do you know about it? Why not? And then you're having a different kind of conversation. So those are just a few, small rhetorical tricks just to get things off, kind of an antagonistic path. What you said about the editorial board is absolutely true. People have the idea that correspondents choose what story they want to write, so that I wake up in the morning as an AP correspondent and I decide I'm going to write the story about settlements and that's what I'm going to write. It doesn't work that way. As a correspondent here for most places, your job is it's not like you're driving a car, it's like you're shoveling coal on a locomotive. So the track has been laid, man. I mean, it is going. And you can either shovel coal onto the, into the locomotive, or you can find another job. But that's where I found myself at the AP. It wasn't like I could wake up in the morning and write what I just told you. You can't. The narrative has been set. The narrative is set, and the job of most journalists here is to take bits and pieces of reality and slot it in to the existing script about what is going on. The existing script actually has very little to do with what's going on, which is why no one can understand what's going on here. That's a story. Now, there was another... Oh, David, right. Are the soldiers affected by the narrative? I think to a large extent, no. Most Israeli kids don't read international media. They're not that aware of the world outside Israel, as most 18-year-olds in America are not. Those who are more internationally attuned are disturbed by it. Certainly guys who get out of the army and kind of go to college in the States or work internationally, they get disturbed by it. Sometimes their heads get turned by it, but they're definitely affected by it. It's an increasingly international world, and it's harder and harder for people to live in a bubble of their own making. I think that the Israeli army's claim to purity of arms is a bit annoying for people, and one response to it is to come back and say, oh, you have purity of arms. Well, then what about this and this and this and this? Although I don't think that for a moment that if we did not have this idea of purity of arms, we would get any less criticism. And I think that criticism relates to your question, which is what is really going on, which I didn't touch on because that's another discussion. But we've talked about people conforming to a narrative. Why is that the narrative? Right? Why is that the narrative? Why is the Israel story a morality story? That's really what the story is here. It's not a political story. It's not a tech story, as we mentioned. It's not a geopolitical story. It's not a Middle East story because it has nothing to do with the rest of the Middle East. It exists in isolation, and it's a story about morality. That's what it's about. Most of the reporters wouldn't understand if I said that to them, but when you get down to it, when people make the call about what to report and how to report it, it's a story about morality. Why? I think because stories about Jews are always stories about morality. That's the role of Jews in the West. They're moral actors, usually moral actors who fail. So when people go after the Israeli army for its claim of purity of arms, I hear an echo of something much older, which is that the Jews have always claimed they have a moral mission, right? And that's annoying. It's an annoying thing to claim that you've been given some kind of special job by God, and you have some kind of special, relationship, and you have a special moral message. One very obvious response to that is, oh yeah? Well then how come you're, and that I think is what's going on here in a deeper sense. I think that the reason that this story pushes those deep buttons for people in the West is not because of geopolitics, and it's not because of, Israel's importance to the Middle East. Israel is not that important in the Middle East, in my opinion. It's because it pushes a deep button in the West, and that's the button. If you have a moral issue at a given time in Western civilization, there will always be some people who will project that issue onto Jews and condemn the Jews for being the carriers of the moral problems. So in the early years of the church, it's theological problems, a lack of compassion, an overemphasis on legalism, things like that. Later on, it's greed, right? People don't like greed, so Jews become symbols of greed. This gets carried over into modern times with communism. People worried about communism associated with Jews, so it's Jewish Bolsheviks and Jewish commissars. You don't really hear about Ukrainian commissars, it's more Jews. If you have a problem with the capitalist system, then it's Jewish bankers. If you have a problem with nationalism, then Jews are tribalists. But if you like nationalism, then Jews are cosmopolitans. And I can give many more examples, but it's a reflex. It's a thought reflex in the West, including among Jews, and including among many good people who have Jewish friends and are not evil in any way. It's a deep thought virus that I think a lot of people don't even understand exists or the way it works. And I think that's what's going on here. And in the press corps, which I should point out, is not made up of evil people. They're not bad people. The people who I worked with at the AP, who I disagree with on many things, were lovely people. And they're reporting this story, which I think is poison for reasons that I think even they didn't understand. Because something much deeper is going on, and that's why Russia can invade Ukraine or Georgia. There's very little response to that in the West, right? There aren't mass protests in Europe. The Russian Orthodox churches in Paris don't need to be secured because it doesn't cause moral outrage. That's just the Russians being Russians, and America can invade Iraq, and people do what countries do, all the nasty stuff that countries do. It's not the same way when the Jewish state operates. That pushes a different button in the West, because the role of Jews in the West is different. And that is the very, very short version of what I think is going on.
Okay, Matti, thank you very, very much. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and enjoy the rest of your trip. It's not all dark and political. Try to have a good time. It's a lovely country, despite everything I've said.